Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Philosophical Talks of the Research Center of the History and Circulation of Philosophical Ideas. Our special guest today is Professor Anthony Julius. The dialogue is occasioned by a large interest of our philosophical community towards two important books that he has authored, Transgressions, The Offences of Art, that you already know and has been translated into Romanian as well, and Trials of Diaspora, History of Anti-Semitism in England. Please let me recall you that Professor Anthony Julius, Chair in Law and the Arts at University College London, and Deputy Chairman of London law firm Mishcon de Reya, joined as Chairman of Oxera's governing board in November 2012. He has 3 careers as a highly regarded litigation lawyer, as a member of a number of commercial and non-profit boards, and as an academic and author. He has degrees from Cambridge University and University College London. Professor Julius is known for his opposition to new anti-Semitism, the expression of anti-Semitic prejudice, couched in terms of certain kinds of discursive assaults on Israel, and gives frequent talks on the subject all over the world to raise awareness. Former Vice President of the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, Professor Anthony Julius is well known for his great efforts to bridge arts and law, and we hope to find more after this encounter about his latest projects regarding the analysis of censorship of the arts in liberal democracies. Good evening, Professor Julius, and thank you very much for taking from your valuable time to be with us today.
Very good to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. So, Professor, one of the greatest challenges of your volume, Transgression, The Offences of Art, is to track artistic phenomena throughout the lenses of transgression. You consider it a very well-defined aesthetics, which was embraced majorly by Western forms of art, especially by visual art. And this book advances 3 types of transgressive art that emerge from defining formal practices related to specific artistic norms. For example, the Blue Boy of Gainsborough, overcoming moral taboos, or the Red Flag of Judy Chicago, or reacting to political determinations in terms of propaganda or resistance. Well, however, it seems to me that in general terms, you plea in favor of the incompatibility between the position of the artist and the position of the moralist. What we can do at best, it seems, to track the tensions and complementarities between law and art, and I would add, if I may, to seek the multiple manners in which the progress of these 2 domains has emerged from the conflict between them. Therefore, here is my question. Professor Julius, what would you claim regarding the following thesis, that Transgressions, The Offences of Art is a book that tests the progress of art? Because I was wondering if you would be the partisan of a dialectical rather than a linear representation of the historical progress of arts, and what would be the normative construction of art, the specific argument that calls for the recurrence and hence for a dialectical history of art?
Very interesting question. I could commit the next hour to an incomplete answer to that question. But since I know there are other questions, and since there is a lot for us to discuss, let me limit myself to 2 points. The first point, in a sense, I'm going to call the dialectical point. And the second point will address this question of the relationship between art and morality, which we can then talk about later. We can talk about both later, but those seem to be the 2 points, at any rate, in your very interesting part question, part exposition, which demand an immediate response. Let me, on the dialectical question, let me begin by giving a personal response. Every book that I've written has 2 provoking or stimulating moments for me. The first is an encounter which requires an explanation. And the second is a rooting of that encounter in some earlier experiences of my own in my own life. So something which is both problematical in the sense that it demands an interpretation, but is also personal in the sense that it resonates with some earlier experience. Now, in the case of Transgressions, the encounter across 1 year was with a series of artworks which are unrelated to any broader political, cultural war type question, where one would then expect routinely art controversies to arise. I mean, in part because they're deliberately manufactured. Just a sense that suddenly art had become problematic in a way that was surprising, because of an earlier history of art, which was in one sense understood as a decensoring movement across a number of decades in the West, but in part also to do with a broader sense that art actually represented no particular threat and therefore did not invite a coercive antagonistic response. And so it was a break with that. And the experience that I had that came to my mind was just my own arguments with my parents as a child, as a young adolescent. I want to see this, I want to read that. And my own experience of it, endlessly being told you're not old enough, you're not ready for it, so you would break some rule of certification if you want to go to that film, or you wouldn't be able to access that book in the library because that would be in a special section. So a related sense of personal constraint and a more impersonal encounter with an art that had become newly problematical. And the way that so that was in a sense what stimulated me to start thinking about writing the book Transgressions, to explain why art had become newly problematical, but also to make sense of my own sense of being restrained in some way from the experiences of certain kinds of artwork and literary text. So that's that. But then there's a second aspect, and that is this question of the way in which art, so to speak, progresses. And you postulated two alternative routes. The first is a simple linear route, where you imagine a kind of artistic vocabulary which is under pressure from the most innovative and original artists of expansion. You could understand it in problem-solving terms or in other terms, but essentially art has a particular direction, and it is, so to speak, the job in the received avant-gardist understanding of art for the artist to take the next step. Mm-hmm. And then against that, there is this sense of art in a sense of action and reaction, more in terms perhaps to be understood of a pendulum, moments of restraint, moments of liberation, moments of creativity, moments of convention, and so on. And the creativity and the transgressive are understood as, in some sense, intimately connected. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if it turned out that the transgressive was also the conventional? So I started thinking about what a dialectical history would look like, but which, so to speak, troubled or upset the categorical alignments. Now, the problem of writing a history of that kind is that, and this is dialectical in the kind of stricter, narrower Hegelian sense. The writer who is interested in ideas and in the historical grounding of ideas is constantly presented with this dilemma. Does he privilege the history over the ideas, or the ideas over the history?
Correct.
I mean, in a sense, it is the problem in Hegel, but it is the problem for every writer. So obviously, one way of writing a history to solve that problem, except that to my mind it's an unsatisfactory solution, is to privilege the history in the sense of the chronology. So one gives an account of artists across a period of time, and to the extent that those artists engage with certain concepts, that's acknowledged. But the concepts themselves are never interrogated beyond their location in the individual artist. The reverse concept privileged approach is to focus on the concepts and treat the artworks and the artists as mere illustrations of the concepts. So you have kind of timeless sense of certain kinds of artistic activity just illustrated by this or that artwork. I mean, it's more obvious, and it's a more standard way of proceeding in political philosophy, for example, or in epistemology, where you might say, well, a particular view on the nature of the self, or the way in which we acquire knowledge, was taken by, you know, X ancient philosopher, Y Renaissance philosopher, Z 19th century philosopher, and in a sense it doesn't matter who you're talking about, certainly when or where they lived. You're simply moving conceptual counters around on a kind of atemporal board. So how to write a history which respects time and also concepts, that's a challenge too. Now, Transgressions, my book Transgressions, attempts to address all of those challenges. It attempts to make deep historical sense of encounters of my own across relatively few months. It attempts to relate the encounter to my own moments in my own history. Because quite apart from anything else, my own feeling is no book that stands even a chance of having any merit is written disconnected from the priorities and obsessions of the author. I think yes, that address that, having attempted to solve the priority of concepts, priority of time challenge, I generated a book which actually I hadn't gone back to for years.
I know. That's why I'm asking those questions. I know.
And I'm kind of provoked by your questions to think about something that I hadn't thought about for a long time.
Speaking about that, Professor, I was thinking that when this book appeared, at least in Romania, it was a bestseller because we were all wondering what's the future of contemporary art, where this anomic structure seems to spread more and more. But nowadays, I think that we live in a sort of counter-transgressive society because we have this phenomena, which is quite annoying, cancel culture. And I was thinking that if Anthony Julius would write a second volume of Transgressions, Would he pay attention to cancel culture? We see nowadays lots of voices arguing that we should close Michelangelo's statue of David. We should move the statue of President Theodore Roosevelt from the front of the American Museum of Natural History. That Shakespeare's literature, that I know that you have been in charge with, has to be decolonized because suggests different inequality phenomena. So what's the point nowadays of transgressions? What do you think that is the future of art in the age of countercultures, counter-transgression and cancel culture?
Well, I'm reading a book at the moment called Shameless Authors, which is about censorship of literature and the arts.
Excuse me, just a second, Professor. If you could turn the microphone a little bit closer. Perfect.
Is that better?
Yeah,
is that
wonderful.
better? Okay.
Perfect.
I'm writing a book at the moment about censorship. Okay. I address the question of cancel culture, among other things, although I have to say, I think broadly speaking, cancel culture is less of a problem in the art world today than geopolitical pressures, China, for example. But to return to your question, I mean, broadly speaking, my view of this is the essential, which is that the proper response to artworks that one finds difficult or objectionable is either to simply turn away from them, or alternatively to engage them in some kind of interpretive manner, which may well include a certain kind of tone of and I don't know whether the English here can be picked up with the kind of necessary precision, but in a manner of censorship rather than censorship, where you know, to censure, C-E-N-S-U-R-E, is to open to condemnation on reasoned grounds of work, as distinct from censorship, which is simply to repress it. I don't myself see any objection at all to saying of a particular work, this is a bad work for these reasons. I don't even see any objection to somebody saying, I wish that work had never been written or made, because one understands that kind of sentiment. But once something is in the world, I think it demands attention. And then the question is, what is the proper attention? But to wish out of the existence something which is in existence, this seems to me something which is deeply destructive and objectionable. So if you were wondering what I would say about a particular case of cancel culture, I think I could probably predict that my response would be to oppose it, to oppose the censoring of the work.
So that's one side of the road. Nowadays in contemporary art, we have this threat from cancel culture, and we're clear with your position on it, but we have the other side, meaning the art markets that register a boom from wherever you're looking at. And it seems to me that it's one of the greatest challenges nowadays that comes somehow from the side of artistic capitalism. So we tend to aestheticize our life and we tend to pay more for art. At a first glimpse, that's good, but somehow at the end of the day, I have the impression that we pay so much for transgressive art because transgression by itself, it's expensive. You pay for the courage, you pay for the creativity, but some voices argue that you do not pay for the artistic complexity that leads to such costs, because if we just take a look to the art markets, we'll see that a Pollock number 78 was almost $200 million, and it costs more than Monet, that was almost reaching $80 million, or Tizian, which comes from quite a mimetical approach, quite developed. Some people will say it's lots of artistic effort there. And Diana and Callisto were barely taking $71.7 million. So why do you pay so much for transgressive art? What's the main reason for that? Why do we pay so much for offenses of art, to be more specific?
It's interesting, isn't it? And it's such a complicated question. To tease out the distinctions would take quite some time. I mean, let me grant the premise. Let me grant the premise that art, which is transgressive, also has huge market appeal. And so then let's ask why, but let's first identify why that's counterintuitive. The point is, in simple terms, if by transgressive we understand something that people recoil from, then it doesn't really make sense that a work that one recoiled from is a work that one would want to own and live with, or that enough people would want to own that it would drive the price up to these stratospheric levels. So that's the puzzle. And let's grant that. But when I've answered that, I want to go back and interrogate the premise, because I think it can be unpacked and we can go in a different direction. But for the moment, let's grant premise. There is obvious intellectual, critical connection between the aesthetic appreciation of a work and its market value. Certainly not in relation to contemporary or modern work that's being made now, or work that is less than 100 years old. We know that that the deformations of fashion and the highly fluctuating character of reputation and esteem mean that it's not a useful index of aesthetic value to look at price. And that, of course, only concerns artworks. It doesn't concern literary works. So this question doesn't arise, for example, in relation to the kind of transgressive literature of the 20th century. I mean, no one is talking about the high price that a Bataille novel or a newly discovered a novel of the Marquis de Sade has got in a particular auction, because it's in the nature of the economics of literary production that the kind of endlessly multiplied copy of the work means that any individual instance of it comes at a very low and easily affordable price. So bracket that, the individual artwork. Bracket also, of course, that whole realm which is the specifically anti-art work, performance art, Metzger's auto-destructive art, the kind of art of the 60s and the 70s, the 1960s and 70s, that specifically resist Hans Hacker's work, specifically resisted the kind of call it capitalist embrace. But still, return to your question, why is it? I think the answer is that transgression has to be understood in a much more differentiated way. So a work which is, I mean, within my own typology of transgressions, a work that is formally transgressive, a work that was immensely innovative in a kind of iconoclastic way, within the history of art making, within the internal history of art making, is transgressive, without at the same time being, repellent in the sense, particularly if we've moved on 50 or 60 or 70 years. And it may be that's the reason. What we do is we analyze out the different meanings of transgression in order to overcome the apparent contradiction in the proposition that people are prepared to pay a lot of money for transgressive work. So it may be that's the answer. But can I now go back and interrogate the premise?
Yes, please.
There is something about the artwork which permits the suspension of certain moral categories. And so what we would find repellent in day-to-day life, what we would find objectionable were it to be, so to speak, reported as an event in the first pages of the newspaper, we're more than content to see enacted in a play or represented in a picture. This is a very old crux. I mean, this is as old as Aristotle. The sense that art represents a kind of licensed space in which transgressive fantasy is allowed free play is very important, and we need to hold on to it, and we need to understand how important it is in our lives, because it's what connects our thinking with the world, or one of the things that connects our thinking with the world. We're all of us much stranger than we acknowledge or disclose to our fellows. And if it wasn't for art providing some external home for our strangeness, we would feel even more alienated and alone in the world than perhaps we do.
That's wonderful, because I was listening to you and I was recalling several examples from the transgressions. For example, I don't know, Gilbert and George. It will never reach an amount of capital that might be shocking, and yet it's something related to our limit of, let's say, enduring, supporting, encapsulating certain senses. So I think that this discussion could be easily turned to those trap subjects such as what's good art and bad art, but actually transgression is not about good art and bad art, it's about the limits of art and the limits of your receptance, to say so. So now it makes a point. Now, with your permission, Professor, I would like to take the side a little bit from visual arts to performance arts, because that's a quite sensitive topic. And I have a case, a legal case for you, to say so, inspired by what Marina Abramovich did in 1974. I will just recall for our audience the details of this performance event. So she fired up the entire world of performance by engaging a 6-hour project. It was called Rhythm Zero. It was held in Naples. And she asked the audience to act on her body by any of the 72 objects left on a table, including roses, scissors, scalpels, and here comes the danger, gun loaded with one bullet. It was one bullet, and yet it was one. And her objective was to test how far the public would go in these particular terms. She left a statement on the table with specific instructions that it seemed to me interesting to comment with you, since you have this judicial eye on the case. And with your permission, I will quote the content of the note. Instructions: there are 72 objects on the table that one can use on me as desired. Performance: I am the object. During the period, I take full responsibility. Duration: 6 hours, 8 p.m. to a.m. Of course, that At a first glimpse, something relevant for our human nature reveals from this case. It was her courage on the one side. And on the other side, it's the courage of the public whenever it meets this kind of transgressive art, from which confrontation is excluded. Because after the performance, Abramovich held a declaration, and I quote, "What I learned was that if you leave it up to the audience, they can kill you. I felt really violated. They cut up my clothes, stuck rose thorns in my stomach. One person aimed the gun at my head and another took it away. It created an aggressive atmosphere. After exactly 6 hours, as planned, I stood up and started walking toward the audience. Everyone ran away to escape an actual confrontation." End of the quote. So here are my 2 questions for you, Professor. First of all, are these performative artistic experiences creating a problematic precedent for the world of law, since artists tend to abdicate more and more voluntarily to their will and expose themselves to any potential crime, especially to actions that could lead to death? And secondly, how would it look like a trial constructed on a case of an artist who has lost his or her life during a performance as a consequence of an intended action belonging to an individual from the audience? I mean, it's a major difference between what André Breton wanted with his surrealist dream of shooting people walking down the streets by the means of imagination, and you have quoted him and discussed the surrealist manifesto in your book. And it's another thing when Marina Abramović comes here offering you a real context in which she gives anyone the opportunity to go after a murder. What would the written declaration of Abramovich lead to? An acquittal of the defendant, or on the contrary, it will have no relevance?
Good. So, two parts to this. First, a law question, and second, what is the place of Abramovich's performance in art history generally? On the first point, I mean, just the legal question. There is a in English law, there's a principle known by the Latin tag volenti, and the longer Latin tag is volenti non fit injuria, which is it translated loosely, I suppose, as if you consent, it is not an actionable injury. It's not something you can sue on. So the obvious example of that would be the boxer. When you climb into a ring in a boxing match, you can't afterwards sue your adversary for assault because you consented to be battered, essentially. So I imagine if Abramovich, I mean, to take the premise of your question, if Abramovich were to sue a person who stuck rose thorns in her stomach, the answer, the defense would be volenti. You said there are 72 objects on the table that can be used on fired. I'm an object. During this period, I take full responsibility. I mean, it's very interesting, that conjunction. How can an object take responsibility for anything? I mean, it immediately raises it's such an interesting question. I mean, you can do whatever you want to a stone you find on a walk in the park, because a stone is a mere object. But you don't say the stone takes responsibility for the violence you visit on it. So what is it to take responsibility for one's objecthood? I find that an interesting question to reflect on. Maybe because it's just paradoxical. But in any event, if Abramovich were to sue the rose thorn aggressor, then I think that aggressor, I want to say he because I just assume as a man, I'm afraid, I suppose it needed to be, he could have said, you consented.
Mm-hmm.
There was a case, an English case that went to the European Court, and it was a case involving sadomasochistic sex, and some very unpleasant things were done to private parts, and the question was, could the state regulate that if all the participants in this collective sadomasochistic act consented? So I think that the legal question would be answered in those terms.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I've got anything else to say on that aspect. On the other aspect, which is what is the place of this event, this performance act in art history? This seems to be a thing which maybe can be traced back to Duchamp, or maybe a little earlier, but let's say Duchamp, which is where a certain interrogation of art making becomes the way in which one makes art. So you say to yourself, well, up to now, art has been a game played by certain rules. What if we just abandon those rules? What if we just alternatively violated them? In other words, if we kept the rules but kept them in a transgressed state, if we acted as if they didn't exist, while at the same time acknowledging their existence, what would happen then? What kind of art would be made that deliberately constructed itself by reference to the rules or the norms that governs art making hitherto? And sometimes really interesting work is done, and sometimes, it's not very interesting. There's the nature of the engagement between the artist and the audience, the problematic nature of that engagement, is a very well-known modernist crux, which goes back to Flaubert in literature at the very least, Baudelaire. That sense of a mutual antagonism, of an uncomprehending and hostile audience, of a scornful and attacking artist, or the Maximilian Manet pictures, which I talk about in my book, where look at the angle of fire. In a sense, you could say, well, it's the artist firing at the audience, or something or someone outside of the frame, maybe at the emperor. In a sense, it was only a matter of time before that kind of play, the language and the iconography of violence, wasn't translated into something literal, something material, something involving actual injury to bodies. I can't remember the name of the work, but I think I talk about it in Transgressions, where the artist strapped himself into a chair, and there was a 1 in 10 million chance that when the gun was fired, it would kill him. I can't remember it. That kind of risk taking by the artist. The reason maybe I can't remember it is because I don't find it a very interesting kind of art practice.
Me neither, but I recall that it was from the second part of your book.
Yes, it doesn't. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
I mean, there's a kind of attention-seeking banality about it, a kind of thinness of conception. And I think the fact that we can't remember the name, we should treat as the beginning of a critique of the work.
So here is the topic of remembrance. Freud would have something to say on that.
Indeed.
Now, Professor, we talked about Marina Abramović, but we have another case here, and I was wondering, how would it be if you would have been the lawyer of Andy Warhol a few years ago when he had a legal problem? For our audience, I would like to recall in short the terms of this case. We all know that in the world of art, there is a lot of transplant of methods, motives, structures, and the topic of originality is quite sensitive. I recall Picasso's statement that all the good artists copy, great artists steal. And yet we have well-known cases, such as the scandal between Andy Warhol and Patricia Caulfield, based on the similarities of the flower screen print. There were two major problems, in my opinion. One was represented by the ethical and the judicial conflict, of course. We all know that Caulfield's flowers have been engaged into a Warhol's technical style, meaning a photographic silk-screen printing. And he could argue by appealing to transgressive art that formally his artwork encapsulates the first, but overcomes it by using a radically new background and the serial representation that engages varying colors, and that's a trademark for his style. But on the other side, we have the material implications of this case emerging from the association of one and the same artistic representation with two different artists that enjoy quite different reputation and cultural capital, because when those flowers became Warhol's flowers, the artwork became quite expensive, unlike the case of Caulfield's photography, which remained less valuable. In short, Warhol ended up having to pay a royalty for use of this image, but it was quite modest. But that's not my point. What I would like to ask you in turn is, how far can someone go in court by using transgressive art as a form of excuse for moral similarities in art that could be interpreted as plagiarism? How would you have dealt with Warhol's case in court?
There are cases on this, and the courts are, broadly speaking, quite clear about this. If there is no element of originality, then the appropriation, if the work, of course, is in copyright, if it's not in copyright, no one cares. I mean, no one in the legal world cares. But if the work is in copyright, then absent any element of originality, and it's not enough to say, oh, but there was this very interesting movement in the 1970s called appropriation art, and photographs were taken and recropped, or images and so on and so forth. Because the lawyer's answer would be, well, maybe, but the law is the law, and there it is. If you want to do that interesting stuff, then do it with work that isn't in copyright. And if the response to that is, well, that wouldn't have the same transgressive sting, then the lawyer's response is, well, you've got your sting and now you have to pay for it. So I don't. There was a very interesting case in the Supreme Court. I can't remember the name of it now, but it involved the Roy Orbison song "Pretty Baby," and there was a group that appropriated that song and sampled it and did some stuff to it, and they were able to persuade the court that it was a kind of creative use of this material rather than the replication of it. And that feels a sensible legal resolution, so that it's not enough for the copyright owner to say, this is my work, pointing to the defendant's work. The copyright owner also has to say, and there has been nothing of a transformational character done to it. Of course, in the Warhol case, there was a transformational act, but the transformational act was entirely within the realm of the art market, because, as you say, the sprinkling of Warholian fairy dust on the work immediately enhanced its value.
Yeah. So reputation, it seemed to me quite problematic there. And it says something not especially on the law, because the judicial world is quite specific. It says something about the nature of art, and especially the nature of contemporary art, because we tend to track those cases of exception. Now, since we do not have too much time at our disposal, with your permission, I would like to go to the last two questions of our meeting. So there is a topic that I would like to address, the Trials of Diaspora, one of your latest books. That considers a history of anti-Semitism in England. I use it quite a lot to my classes of biopolitics as a powerful tool to understand what I appreciated very much as a new reflective perspective in the realm of history of anti-Semitism, namely what you call their national dispositions towards certain attitudes and political practices that could depict anti-Semitism, especially in England. Now, I was wondering, what would you consider about those opinions that take diasporic narratives as too dangerous to encapsulate them in any matter concerning the study of the Holocaust? Because after the origin of totalitarianism of Hannah Arendt, something happened. The 1970s, 1980s, were decades in which flourished colonial and post-colonial studies. And those who defend this position say that engaging diasporic narratives or competitive narratives of martyrdom or things like that could minimize the topic of anti-Semitism, because you tend to address what is common for different diasporic identities and not what's different, and creates a particularity regarding the violences to which they have been subjected across history. So how would you defend your research from those who consider that diasporic challenges minimize the history of anti-Semitism?
It's a very interesting question. Let me give a simple answer to it. And then I'll try and complicate it. We're all familiar with the distinction between the bird's eye view and the worm's eye view.
Of course.
So if a bird is flying high above a landscape, it tends to see a large part of the landscape and can identify the forest, the town, the railway station, the beach and the sea beyond it, and would be a reliable cartographer if the bird was capable of map making. But obviously there's a certain limitation in that perspective, because actually the specificities, the distinctnesses of the individual trees, the differences between the houses, the physiognomies of the people, that would just be an undifferentiated blur. What about the worm's eye view? The worm is the expert on the blade of grass right in front of him. The worm has an understanding of that blade of grass, which the bird cannot compete with. So you understand where I'm going.
It's not a tension between them. They offer two different.
They're doing different things. Now, obviously, there are birds flying at different heights, and there are creatures on the ground still that are larger than a worm and have a great freedom of movement and the distance from the ground and so on, of course. And I don't want to associate different kinds of history writing or political analysis with different kinds of animals or birds. But you could imagine a kind of zoology of writing which would relate certain kinds of writing to certain kinds of animals' perspective.
That would be a new trend in hermeneutics for sure.
Exactly. Why don't we co-author something, a zoology of perspectives?
That would be nice. I accept the challenge.
Okay. So what animal is represented by my writing? Because obviously you can say, well, to write about anti-Semitism is to worm's eye a view of a particular form of heterophobia, a particular form of antagonism towards the other, and that that kind of antagonism can only be understood in a much more kind of bird's eye view way. Or you could say it's too generalizing a perspective, and to write about 1,000 years of history risks simplification to the point of banality. So the attack can be both from the worm and the bird. Maybe I'm some, giraffe, quite high from the ground, but not high enough to have the bird's eye perspective.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I understand that. I can see what I can see writing from my height, and either people find that helpful and interesting to integrate it into their broader reading, so they will also read worm's eye studies and bird's eye studies. Perhaps they will populate an entire zoo with different approaches, and I will simply be one of the more exotic animals in my own cage.
I will recall this. But yeah, actually, it seems to me as well that it's a win-win situation, and we shouldn't discriminate the two domains. I think that they are complementary somehow, and the transfer of methods could bring some more comprehensive undertakings of the topic of anti-Semitism. Now, going to the last question, Professor, it strikes a little bit the two of the most important parts of your career in this academic field, the history of art and history of anti-Semitism. We all know Agamben's perspective from the remnants of Auschwitz, for which he engaged the relevance of a testimonial belonging to a survivor or a relative of a victim, as crucial to learn how to combat evil in history, or to understand how to take moral responsibility whenever you attempt to promote cultural heritage of remembrance. Now, he largely discussed cases such as Primo Levi's. I just taking him because it's one of the most reputed, who refused to write his testimonies on Auschwitz until the day he got the impulse to confess that he has ever lived in order not to let the witness from himself to die until he tells everything, what he endured and what he has seen in Auschwitz. Now, the same Adorno, to whom you devoted the last pages of your Transgression, said that we should continue to cultivate memorial heritage of Holocaust because we need to prevent something as awful and inhuman as the Holocaust was to happen again in history. And it's well known, his dictum, that writing poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. So we have to address to the public spheres the matter of anti-Semitism, but not any time and not in any form, if Adorno would be right. So poetry seems to be the most subtle form. So we are going back to arts in order to address such sensitive topics such as mass atrocities. And with this, I get to my last question for you. Professor Julius, is art powerful enough to combat anti-Semitism nowadays and to preserve remembrance on the Holocaust? Or in the contrary, it is barbaric to attempt to produce any artistic discourse on such topics after Auschwitz, and Adorno is right?
So I think that, first of all, one has to understand, one has to try and situate Adorno's remark. Adorno comes out of an intellectual tradition which accords huge value to the artwork and integrates the understanding of art and the artwork in a broader philosophical perspective, unlike the Anglophone, the Anglo-American intellectual tradition, certainly of political thinking, which has really no time for, no interest in art. Art, I mean, it's so strong. It is the commitment to art in this larger political theoretical perspective that when Hegel actually demotes art to the, so to speak, the second tier below the philosophical resolution, it's considered to be almost a scandal, and Adorno returns to a kind of just a pre-Hegelian perspective. I mean, one associates with Schelling, or a moment in Schelling's intellectual trajectory, where art is, so to speak, the last word in intellectual and spiritual artistic endeavor. So what Adorno wanted to say coming out of that tradition was the most radical thing, which is, in my tradition, where art is accorded the highest value, nonetheless, the Holocaust makes it an atrocity to attempt an artwork. So it's a kind of statement of despair from within a very specific, determinate, philosophical, spiritual perspective. And I think when one understands that the remark of Adorno's doesn't seem so prescriptive. It doesn't seem, it's not received as simply a direction to artists, stop writing poetry. I mean, speaking for myself, broadly speaking, artworks, works of literature, for me, are the most complex engagements with moral and political questions that I have encountered. King Lear has more to say to me about politics than Hobbes's Leviathan, for example, although they share certain themes. But that's a personal perspective. It might explain why I've committed so much of my own thinking time to considering relations between law and the arts.
Good. So, Professor, I'm afraid that our encounter reached its end, but I must confess that this talk has been one of the greatest honors that I have enjoyed in my academic life. Thank you for sharing your valuable time with us, and whenever this pandemic becomes gentle, it would be our greatest pleasure to have you here as an invited professor whenever you agenda allows us. Thank you all for tuning in. See you next time at the same hour for another philosophical talk.